Early October 1993. As Americans went about their daily routines, pouring morning coffee, driving to work, settling in for evening news, they were stunned by reports flooding in from a place most had never heard of. In the streets of Mogadishu, Somalia, their sons were fighting and dying in one of the most intense urban battles American forces had faced in decades. 2 Black Hawk helicopters lay smoldering in hostile streets. Nearly 100 American soldiers were surrounded by thousands of armed militants. And the world was about to witness what happens when a surgical military operation transforms into a desperate fight for survival. This is the story of the Battle of Mogadishu, the incident the world would come to know as Black Hawk Down.
The Illusion of Clean War, 1992. Riding high on victory, the American military complex stood at the pinnacle of global power. The Cold War had ended without nuclear catastrophe. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, once the 5th largest army on Earth, had been crushed in a stunning display of technological superiority during the Gulf War of 1991. Smart bombs gliding down ventilation shafts, precision strikes broadcast on television screens. War, it seemed, had evolved into something clean, surgical, almost antiseptic. The footage was intoxicating. Targeting pod displays showed missiles finding their marks with computer game precision. The gruesome reality of ground combat, the blood, the screaming, the chaos, remained largely hidden from public view. Politicians and citizens alike began to believe a dangerous fiction, that technology had rendered close-quarters combat obsolete, that future wars could be won from the air, fought like video games with minimal American casualties. Military leaders warned against this delusion. They knew the truth. War would never be clean. But outside the Pentagon, few were listening. The stain of Vietnam seemed washed away, replaced by a dangerous confidence that there was no military operation America couldn't execute cleanly and surgically. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong.
Somalia, where humanity goes to die. While America celebrated its victories, Somalia was descending into a hell that defied imagination. Drought had come first, turning farmland to dust. Then came civil war in 1988, when rebel factions rose against President Mohamed Siad Barre's socialist government. They overthrew him in 1991 and then turned their guns on each other. What followed was barbarity of the darkest kind. Warlords like General Mohamed Farrah Aidid discovered that food could be wielded as a weapon. Starvation became strategy. Opponents and their families were deliberately starved to death. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. In the first 3 months of 1992 alone, 300,000 people died of starvation. Another 1.5 million teetered on the edge of malnutrition. 3 million fled as refugees, nearly a third of the country's 10 million people. Imagine a population the size of London and a third of them dead, dying, or fleeing for their lives. The world watched in horror. The United Nations brokered ceasefires that existed only on paper. Peacekeeping forces arrived, 50 soldiers at first, then more, but they were ill-equipped and overwhelmed. By November 1992, Aidid openly defied the UN Security Council, demanding the withdrawal of peacekeepers and declaring hostile intent against any further deployments. The peacekeepers were under siege. The mission was collapsing, and pressure mounted on the United States to intervene.
December 1992, America arrives. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and hero of the Gulf War, proposed a solution, a massive but brief American intervention under U.S., not UN command. The mission would be simple: deliver relief supplies, prevent the UN mission's collapse, and get out before becoming entangled in a long, bloody campaign. For President George H.W. Bush, facing an election year and criticism over his handling of Somalia, it seemed like a low-risk opportunity to maintain American prestige and UN authority. The mission was christened Operation Restore Hope. On December 9, 1992, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Mogadishu, not to gunfire, but to camera flashes. The world's media had descended on the airport to document the moment. Local populations greeted American forces with jubilation. Warlords, recognizing they couldn't face American firepower, either retreated or agreed to cooperate. Some even surrendered their heavy weapons. At its height, Restore Hope involved 30,000 troops from 23 nations: American, Australian, Canadian, French, Moroccan, Pakistani. They secured aid convoys, they brought stability, they saved lives. Back home, Americans felt that familiar glow of mission accomplished. The race began to transfer operations back to the UN and withdraw. The fear haunted every commander that some incident, some accident would force America to expand its mission and drag the country into years of warfare. Vietnam's ghost still walked the halls of the Pentagon.
Spring 1993, when everything changes starting in late April, Restore Hope began winding down. On May 4th, the mission formally ended, transferring to a new UN force under Turkish Lieutenant General Çevik Bir, with U.S. Major General Thomas Montgomery as deputy. But the transition was chaos. The new UN force was still arriving as American troops departed. And the warlords noticed something crucial. These UN peacekeepers didn't command the same respect as the Americans. They seemed weaker, less committed. Hostility grew exponentially in the weeks that followed. Then came June 5, 1993, the day everything changed. Mohamed Farrah Aidid's Somali National Alliance ambushed a Pakistani peacekeeping force. When the smoke cleared, 24 UN soldiers lay dead, 44 more wounded. The next day, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 837, authorizing aggressive action against Aidid and his followers. America dispatched AC-130 gunships for heavy fire support. The aircraft flew psychological warfare missions, raided weapons storage facilities, destroyed Aidid's propaganda radio station. A reward was posted, $25,000 for the most wanted man in Somalia, a fortune for the average Somali. Aidid was now a hunted man, but he was also cornered and dangerous. On August 8th, he retaliated, detonating a bomb under a U.S. Army military police vehicle. 4 MPs died in the explosion. The gloves came off. August 1993. The hunters arrive. Secretary of Defense Les Aspin authorized the deployment of a joint Special Operations Task Force with one mission: capture Aidid. Task Force Ranger combined America's most elite warriors, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force operators, supported by specialized helicopters optimized for day-night operations. Nearly 100 of America's finest soldiers under the command of General William F. Garrison. They operated outside UN command structure. This was an American operation with American rules. Between August and September 1993, Task Force Ranger conducted 6 raids on known safe houses of Aidid and his supporters. Almost all were successful, with one embarrassing exception: mistakenly raiding an unregistered UN building, temporarily detaining confused UN workers. Aidid himself remained frustratingly elusive. But on September 21st, Task Force Rangers scored a major victory: the capture of Osman Otto, one of Aidid's top lieutenants, near Mogadishu's Digfur Hospital. The operation went smoothly, but the helicopters took heavy fire from rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, weapons designed to destroy tanks and fortified positions. Against the thin-skinned aircraft, they would be devastating. It was an omen no one heeded. September 25th, the first to fall, Aidid was trapped, and like any cornered animal, he lashed out. His men mounted ambushes, planted bombs, and prepared for the Americans' next move. In the early hours of September 25th, 4 days after Otto's capture, Black Hawk callsign Courage 53 was conducting reconnaissance over the city when militants opened fire with RPGs. One grenade struck the aircraft, igniting onboard fuel. 3 soldiers died instantly: pilot Chief Warrant Officer Dale Schrader, co-pilot Perry Ulliman, and another crew member. The pilots fought desperately to keep the burning helicopter in the air, to reach friendly lines. But physics and fire won. The aircraft careened into a building and slammed into the street. 2 pilots survived the crash, alive but in serious trouble as hostile forces converged. The 10th Mountain Division's Quick Reaction Force raced to the scene in a 5-ton truck loaded with sandbags for protection. They found themselves surrounded, engaged in a fierce firefight, calling in armed helicopters that operated so close their spent shell casings rained down on American troops below. They recovered the pilots. They rigged the downed aircraft to explode. But before pulling out, one sergeant lost his leg to an RPG. 3 Americans were dead. Private First Class Matthew Anderson, 21, of Lucas, Iowa. Sergeant Eugene Williams, 26, of Chicago. Sergeant Ferdinand Richardson, 27, of Summerhead, California. The city had drawn first blood. But the battle that would define the Somalia intervention, the battle that would change American foreign policy for decades, was still 9 days away.
Into the Black Sea, October 3, 1993, the plan intelligence arrived. 2 of Aidid's senior commanders had been located in a stronghold in the Bakara Market District, the so-called Black Sea, a slum where Aidid's support ran deepest, near the Olympic Hotel. Everyone involved knew this would be the toughest raid yet. They allocated 160 troops, 19 helicopters, 12 ground vehicles. The plan was textbook. Helicopters would transport the assault force to storm the compound, while a blocking force secured the perimeter. Ground vehicles would race in, load prisoners, and speed out before hostile forces could organize. Then everyone would withdraw before the city woke up to what had happened. There was one request: armored vehicles for the ground convoy. It was denied. At 3:30 p.m. on October 3, 1993, the operation began. Sikorsky MH-60 Blackhawks and smaller MH-6 Littlebirds lifted off from the airport, carrying America's finest into the heart of enemy territory. Within minutes, they arrived over the target. The blocking force established their perimeter. The assault teams stormed the building. Then Ranger Private First Class Todd Blackburn missed the rope he was descending and fell 70 feet to the street below. The first American casualty of the day, before the operation truly began. Both teams immediately came under sustained heavy fire, as did support aircraft overhead. But they pushed through, securing 24 detainees. Ground vehicles fought their way through streets increasingly swarmed with armed hostiles, including women and children, all firing on American forces. One truck was disabled by RPG fire and abandoned. But by 4 p.m., the vehicles reached the scene. Detainees were loaded. 3 vehicles were dispatched to evacuate the injured Blackburn. During his evacuation, Sergeant Dominic Pilla was shot and killed, the first U.S. fatality. Confusion reigned. Who was supposed to signal withdrawal? Precious minutes ticked away. Then, at 4:20 p.m., disaster struck.
Super 61, the First Bird Falls MH-60 Blackhawk, call sign Super 61, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer 3 Cliff Elvis Wolcott, circled overhead providing support. Suddenly, an RPG screamed upward. Impact. The aircraft was rocked by the explosion, tail rotor destroyed, spinning wildly out of control before slamming against a building and crashing into the street below. Wolcott and co-pilot CW3 Donovan Briley died in the crash. 2 crew members were seriously injured. 2 snipers aboard, Staff Sergeant Daniel Bush and Sergeant Jim Smith, survived well enough to begin laying down fire against the Somali fighters converging on their position. The mission had just transformed from a quick snatch and grab into a desperate rescue operation. Ground forces fought their way to the crash site through a hurricane of gunfire. An MH-6 Littlebird, call sign Star 41, landed in an adjacent street, its pilot dismounting to pull wounded soldiers into the tiny aircraft while his co-pilot fired his personal weapon from the cockpit. Under intense fire, overloaded with casualties, the Littlebird somehow lifted off and escaped. A dedicated combat search and rescue Blackhawk arrived, roping in its team. But as they descended, the helicopter was hit. The pilots nursed their damaged aircraft away from the crash site, making an emergency landing at the airport.
The rescue team was on the ground, but their ride was gone. In the brutal fighting that followed, more Americans fell. Ranger Corporal Jamie Smith was critically wounded. Then came the call every pilot dreads: "We got a Black Hawk going down."
Super 64, Durant's Fall Super 64, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant, had moved into Super 61's position, providing cover over the first crash site. An RPG streaked upward. Impact. The tail rotor disintegrated. Durant fought for control, tried to limp back to base. Then the entire rotor assembly came apart. The Black Hawk entered an uncontrollable spin. The aircraft crashed into a cluster of tin shacks, killing several Somali civilians on impact, which only enraged more of the population into action. Aidid's men took to loudspeakers throughout the city: "Defend your homes, defend your faith, kill the Americans." Durant was alive but badly injured. Orbiting above Super 64's crash site was Black Hawk Super 62. Aboard were two Delta Force snipers watching the scene unfold below: Sergeant First Class Randy Shugart and Master Sergeant Gary Gordon. They saw the hostile forces converging on Durant's position like sharks drawn to blood. They requested insertion to protect the survivors. Request denied. They could do more from the air. Gordon repeated the request. They were advised insertion could not guarantee their safety. "Roger that," Gordon replied. "Insert us anyway." At 4:42 p.m., Super 62 dropped the two snipers at the crash site and remained overhead providing fire support. Then, at 4:52 p.m., just 10 minutes later, another RPG screamed up and struck Super 62's cockpit, damaging the engine, knocking the co-pilot unconscious. The pilot somehow kept the crippled Black Hawk in the air long enough to limp to safety. But Shugart and Gordon were now alone at the crash site with Michael Durant, surrounded by hundreds of armed, enraged Somalis, closing in for the kill. The convoy of the damned, lost in hell. Meanwhile, the ground convoy was still fighting toward the first crash site, Super 61. They traveled through narrow streets in a near-continuous ambush: machine gun fire, RPGs, explosives. The streets barely resembled their maps. Buildings destroyed, landmarks gone. The convoy became lost. For over 30 minutes they fought through the urban maze, taking casualties, vehicles damaged and destroyed. Finally, the brutal reality became clear. Even if they found the crash site, they would only add to the problem rather than solve it. Too many casualties, too much damage. They couldn't evacuate anyone. The convoy was ordered to fight its way back to the airport. A quick reaction force assembled at the airport, ready to charge out and help, just as they'd done when Courage 53 went down. But Aidid had learned from that earlier incident. He had contingency plans in place. The QRF encountered such severe resistance that they too were forced to abandon the mission and fought to link up with the original convoy so they could support each other in the running battle back to the airport. By the time both convoys limped back to base, the terrible arithmetic was clear. 99 known U.S. troops were fighting for their lives in the city, surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. For the Delta snipers at Super 64's crash site, this news spelled disaster. The last stand. 2 men against an army. The official account states Shugart died first, shot while defending Durant's position. Gordon picked up Shugart's weapon and handed it to the injured Durant so he could continue the fight. Some sources dispute this. Durant may have misidentified who handed him the weapon in the chaos and horror of the moment. What isn't disputed, Gordon was killed shortly after. The crash site was overrun. Every survivor except Durant was beaten to death in a vicious frenzy by the mob. Bodies were stripped, mutilated, dragged through the streets like trophies. Durant's life was spared only by the intervention of one man, Yusuf Dahir Moalem, who wanted to take him alive as a hostage for Aidid. The longest night. Surrounded and alone. At the first crash site, Super 61, the grim reality set in for the Rangers and Delta operators. They were spending the night surrounded by a city that wanted them dead.
They hadn't expected an operation of this scale. They lacked night vision goggles. Ammunition was running desperately low, water even lower. Medical supplies dwindling as wounded men bled into the Mogadishu dust. At 7:08 p.m., a Black Hawk Super 66 made a daring attempt to drop fresh water and ammunition and evacuate the critically wounded Corporal Smith. The aircraft took such heavy fire it nearly crashed. They couldn't extract Smith. At 8:27 p.m., Corporal Jamie Smith died from his wounds. Through the night, the Americans held their perimeter against waves of attacks. AH-6 Little Bird gunships and AH-1 Cobra helicopters prowled overhead, their weapons keeping the worst of the attacks at bay. But the reality was stark. If the Somalis were willing to accept the casualties, they could overrun the position through sheer numbers. The Americans prepared for a last stand. The rescue. Into the night. At the airport, a massive rescue convoy assembled, what remained of Task Force Ranger, Pakistani M48 tanks, Malaysian armored personnel carriers. The formation stretched nearly 2 miles long. At 11:23 p.m., they moved out into a city alive with gunfire and death. One advantage, nightfall had driven many of Aidid's irregular fighters home. But his hardcore militia remained, battle-hardened veterans who had earned the respect of American and UN forces through brutal experience. Pakistani tanks proved invaluable, their main guns clearing roadblocks and firing into windows where hidden gunmen lurked. AH-6 helicopters strafed Somali positions. Cobra gunships unleashed rockets into enemy concentrations. The convoy fought for every block. At 2 a.m. on October 4th, they reached the crash site. Relief flooded through the besieged Americans. They had survived. But the ordeal wasn't over. The Mogadishu Mile. The price of chaos. Every American body had to be recovered, including pilot Cliff Wolcott's, trapped in Super 61's wreckage. It took until 5:30 a.m. to extract him and prepare to move. Then another problem emerged. The rescue convoy, hastily assembled without informing UN commanders beforehand, didn't have room for everyone. As the convoy prepared to leave, dozens of American troops found themselves on foot, using vehicles for cover. In the chaos, some fell behind. They were forced to run, a desperate sprint through 2 kilometers of hostile streets to a rendezvous point at the intersection of Halwadig Road and National Street. This run would enter U.S. military lore as the Mogadishu Mile. By 6:30 a.m., the battle was over. U.S. troops evacuated to a stadium held by Pakistani UN forces. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. The reckoning. When America woke up, Americans awoke to shocking news. 18 of their sons had died during the night fighting in Mogadishu. A 19th would die from wounds 2 days later. Another 73 were wounded, some with life-changing injuries. It was the deadliest firefight involving U.S. troops since Vietnam, and it shattered the illusion that future wars could be fought cleanly like video games. Adding to the horror, images broadcast worldwide of Michael Durant, held hostage somewhere in Mogadishu. And worse, images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets by celebrating crowds. The footage was unbearable, unacceptable. U.S. helicopters flew over the city with loudspeakers, proclaiming they wouldn't leave Durant behind, playing music from AC/DC, his favorite band, to give him hope. Aidid held him for 11 days before releasing him and a captured Nigerian soldier through the Red Cross. Durant returned to service, continuing to fly until 2001 when he retired and entered politics. The withdrawal. Mission abandoned. President Bill Clinton ordered all operations to capture Aidid to cease. Shortly after, he announced U.S. forces would evacuate Somalia by March 1994. On December 15, 1993, Secretary of Defense Les Aspin resigned, taking much of the blame for denying armored vehicles to the operation. On February 4, 1994, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 897, setting out the process for completing the UN mission by March 1995. On December 16, 1994, the U.S. undertook Operation United Shield. On March 6, 1995, the last UN forces withdrew from Somalia. After their withdrawal, Mohamed Farrah Aidid declared himself president of Somalia on June 15, 1995. He was assassinated 14 months later, leaving behind a nation still ravaged by war and poverty. Heroes and lessons. What remains? Many Task Force Ranger members were honored for their service, but the highest awards went to two men, Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart. The Delta Force snipers who insisted on inserting at Super 64's crash site, who fought alone against impossible odds to protect Michael Durant, who gave their lives rather than abandon a brother, they received posthumous medals of honor from President Clinton. Two U.S. Navy ships now bear their names, the USNS Gordon and the USNS Shugart. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten. The battle taught the U.S. military crucial lessons about the dangers posed by lighter-armed but tenacious insurgents, and the unique challenges of urban combat. Many of the young troops who fought in Mogadishu advanced to senior positions over the next decade. When America returned to urban warfare during the War on Terror, those hard-earned lessons, purchased with blood in Somalia's streets, would help save countless lives. But the political lesson was perhaps more significant. The images of dead Americans dragged through Mogadishu's streets fundamentally changed American foreign policy. For years afterward, the Black Hawk Down incident would haunt discussions of military intervention. It contributed to America's reluctance to intervene in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide. It shaped decisions in the Balkans. It cast a long shadow over every discussion of deploying American troops. The battle lasted less than 18 hours, but its echoes would reverberate for decades.